In this video I'm going to finish the coverage of the two knights defense with the variation with the move pawn to b5. Just to recap, up to this point we have covered the variation where white captures on d6, on c6, and black recaptures the bishop. We had also covered the variation where white takes on b5 and allows black to take on d5. And then we moved on to the main move, bishop to f1, after which black plays h6, and so far we covered knight to f3. And just to finish this coverage from black's perspective, of course, we have to look at the main move, which is knight to f7, which is what we'll do to finish this up. So, looking at bishop to f1 and pawn to h6, we have to look at knight to f7. This is the most critical move. It gives up the knight for some material, and by taking here, this is really testing the idea of black. So, of course, black has to recapture, and then white recaptures back on c6, which is the point behind the capture on f7. So it seems that black has an exposed king, and he's down 2 pawns, and he might lose another pawn on b5 here. So it doesn't seem like he has really much to show for it. However, with his next move, black is proving out that he does have an idea. He has 2 pieces developed, white doesn't have any. Again, typical situation in this variation. And black will be able to bring more and more pieces into his attack. The rook will come to f8, and this bishop is also ready to support the attack in any way possible, maybe along this diagonal, but not necessarily. To reduce the risks, white has to play bishop to e2. I had already made a video about other possibilities, such as playing knight to c3, and as a typical illustration of what happens if white's careless, he played knight c3, then he took on b5, black set up the pressure on the f-file, and then after a mistake, pawn to h3, black basically unleashed with bishop to f2. He could have also played knight to g4, which just wins on the spot. Well, objectively it wins. Bishop f2 was also good, and white didn't dare taking it, and then he basically got checkmated fairly soon. This is just a devastating attack. Black checkmated rather quickly here. So this illustrates why white usually plays bishop to e2, trying to cover up the important g4 square. However, that doesn't cover up the e4 square, and there'll be ways to take advantage of that. So rook to f8 is setting up the pressure against f2. White typically castles, that makes sense, and now black goes knight to e4, and the pressure on f2 is set up. Black threatens to take there. There's also a threat of bringing the queen into the attack, with possibly queen to h4. So there are 2 ways for white to handle this. Actually, sorry, at this point the threat against f2 isn't yet set up because black hasn't moved the king, but that's coming. So white has 2 ways to handle this. If he underestimates the threats, he will just try to develop the pieces with knight to c3. I think this is the most common and the most expected development. Objectively, he should go for something like pawn to b4, just to open up his pieces and to reduce the pressure along that diagonal. Unfortunately, then if black takes with the bishop trying to maintain the pressure, the knight to d2 just take the sting out of his idea. And you can try to play this position, and it's definitely an option. There's still some pressure left, black's only down a pawn, things are pretty unclear here. You could try to play it like this. Another way to play is for the endgame, exchange the queens, and in a position like this, try to claim some compensation. Basically, in a position like this, white's up 2 pawns, but he has great difficulties developing his pieces because the knight isn't coming out, and it has to guard the d2 square. The king isn't coming out. If the knight's not coming out, the rook isn't coming out either. So white is basically just trapped in his own camp here, and it probably is not quite enough, but in a practical game it's really hard for white to get to this position, and to play for a win here would be even more difficult. So white has to really sense the dangers of his position and go for d4, and then objectively he has chances for the advantage. If he doesn't sense the dangers and goes with knight to c3, then black can unleash the unexpected attack. He can already take here on f2, and while this hits the queen and threatens to discover check, so it's forced that he takes back. And here black really has a choice. He can just recapture on f2 immediately, or he can play for the pin. If he goes for king g8, then white can continue with knight to e4 just to defend f2. And here it turns out that black can simply exchange, and even though he's down a piece, he doesn't have a problem saving this position. So there are 2 options here for white: just to agree to a draw and go king e1, queen here, king to f1 here, and we basically get a forced draw here with this move that brings the rook into the attack. And now, because there's a threat of rook f8, white has to run with the king, and we get a forced draw here. This is all analysis that was verified with a computer. I suggest you examine the lines on your own and try to understand the dynamics of black's attack, but objectively this should be fine for black. After queen to d4, there's also another option. He can also try to go king to f1, and then another unexpected move, bishop to a6, now setting up the pressure along a different diagonal, also threatening to bring the rook into the attack. After pawn to d3, check, bishop to f3, then black goes pawn to b4, and suddenly, even though black's down a piece, the threat of pawn to e4 is very, very unpleasant, and the pins under which the white pieces are along this diagonal, and along the f-file, and along the d-file, they actually force white to look for the only move, which is bishop to e3, just to gain a tempo but to unpin himself. And in this position, black is fine as well. So to recap, basically after bishop f1 and pawn to h6, white's best chance is to take here on f7. This leads to very non-standard positions that if black has studied, he has the best chance of succeeding in these. And I had played several games in these lines, and generally play goes rather easy for black, especially if he has studied the lines. The idea is very simple, just to double up on f2, or triple up on f2, attack f2 as many times as he can, and white has great difficulties defending it, even with the objectively best moves. Black here should still be fine, in my opinion. There's very few games played in these lines, so if you study and understand these positions, you'll probably have some great results, which I'm hoping these videos are helping with.